Hello, smart friends, and welcome to day 3 of our Smart Cities Week podcast special. In this episode of the Smart City podcast, I have a great chat with Geof Heydon. Geof is an associate at data sharing company, Creator Tech, and co-founder of the IoT Alliance in Australia. Geof shares his background in the telecommunications industry and how that sparked his interest in the smart city space. He is passionate about helping all levels of government to really understand the importance of data and data sharing in the digital economy, and how we all need to be on the same page with protecting and sharing appropriate, sometimes quite sensitive data. We also discuss the importance of councils and state governments taking stock of what's happening first internally in order to make smart decisions about what smart applications are needed, and the interesting evolution in the thinking going on about what makes a livable city or community. Geof shares his thoughts on the patchiness of Australia's adoption of smart concepts and explains how the IoT Alliance came to be. We also discuss why collaboration across industries and disciplines is critical for us to actually be solving the problems we have today, with or without IoT. As always, I hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
It's the Smart City Podcast, whoa, with Smart City experts, here we go. Connecting smart technology, both big and small. Smart cities are making life better for all. Big data, emerging trends, self-driving cars and more. The Smart City Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Geof. How are you?
Hi, Zoe. It's great to be here.
Excellent. Let's jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Yeah, love to. Look, I'm old. I'm really old. So I've been working in the telecommunications industry for 45 years or something like that, scarily. But my interests and my current activity are all around smart city work with a little company branded Creator Tech. We do a lot of work with data sharing policy for local government, and I've been working in data sharing and privacy and data of all kinds for a number of years now. I also am one of the co-founders of the IoT Alliance, the Internet of Things Alliance in Australia, which we set up about 3 years ago. And that's growing like crazy and has been since the day we formed it. And that has a very relevant role to play in the whole smart city world. And I do a number of other things that with startups and all sorts of goodies. So that's me.
Yeah, wow. So tell us what you're passionate about.
Well, my mission right now is to try and get all of the local governments in Australia and all the state and federal governments, for that matter, to really understand the importance of data and data sharing in a digital economy, and really realizing and trying to help them understand that innovation is really only enabled through the sharing of data and information. And that means building ecosystems with partners from unusual places sometimes, and trying desperately to get everybody to be on the same page with the notion of how you protect and share appropriately, sometimes quite sensitive data for the good of both innovation as well as protecting everybody's rights at the same time.
Yeah, cool. So tell us what kind of sparked your interest in the smart city space.
Well, it actually, I have a very, very long history in the telecommunications sector, and it became pretty clear, 5, 6, 7 years ago, that more and more and more sensors were getting connected to the telecommunications networks. And that was sort of creating this whole new Internet of Things growth phase in the world of the Internet. And it's really the third phase. The first phase was all about trying to just connect people to the web and get access to information. Then it sort of became that was like a decade's worth. And there was sort of a decade's worth of thinking about social implications and social media, Facebook, Twitter, all those sorts of things emerged. And then now we're deeply into the third phase of real pervasiveness of the internet, where it's not just people and computers being connected, it's sensors that are getting lower and lower cost. And what makes that kind of interesting from my telecommunications background point of view is that the telecommunications piece of that puzzle becomes a very, very low cost, very uninteresting part of the whole picture. And the real excitement is actually around all the new applications and services that these sensors and networks enable. So I've really shifted my focus from being concerned with, if you like, the pipes and the infrastructure that sit below the internet to the business models and the applications, and it's all digital information. So suddenly the world of digital information is starting to impinge itself on every single industry sector and in every single business. And that's what makes it so game changing and so dramatic.
So basically, like the foundation is already there, and now we're looking at the really cool, innovative stuff, and the different way people are using the internet rather than worrying about how we're going to connect the next town or the next house. That kind of foundational piece is there.
Yeah, what's really interesting is that there's this relentless change and lowering of costs and increase in technology for sensors, for computing. We can kind of easily predict the future of computing. We can easily predict the cost of memory and the cost of processing and all of those things. But what it translates into is if you want to sense something, like measure movement of something or measure the temperature of something or measure the humidity of something or there's dozens, strain, wind, all manner of things, the sensing to do that is getting cheaper and cheaper. So, 25 years ago, when people were sensing components of jet engines, that made sense because jet engines cost a lot of money and so did the sensors. Whereas today, a sensor that did something as complicated as that back then might be only, a few dollars. So you can sense something that's worth only a few tens of dollars. And we also can see that over time, those sensors will get even cheaper. And so we'll be sensing things that are only worth a few cents. I can foresee us having sensors embedded in paper if we ever still need paper. And we can sense and measure things in the lowest cost items. A glass of water will have a sensor in it, and it'll be contributing information about our calorie intake and our health and our hydration and all sorts of things. And these things just get more and more and more pervasive and get more and more interesting as you think about that future.
No, that's really interesting. I hadn't really thought that kind of deeply into it, I suppose. But yeah, the lower the cost, the lower the cost of the actual device, the lower the cost of the things that we're interested in sensing, I suppose.
Yeah, well, and the same is true of the telecommunications network, and the same is true of all of the computing resource used to analyze all this data. So all of these aspects of it are getting lower and lower and more cost effective to do more and more things. And so we're moving now from high cost sensing to very low cost sensing, and that path just continues.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well, let's go on to this next question because I'm sure we'll talk some more about that when we get into it. But what is a smart city to you?
It's the $1 million question. In fact, I was discussing in an Internet of Things working group this morning this very thing, and we decided in our meeting that if you had 100 people and you asked them what the answer to that was, you'd get more than 100 answers. So we already have quite a dilemma on our hands, but fundamentally we see, and in fact I've developed a little model with my colleagues that helps to illustrate this. We see a sort of a 4-phase evolution of smart cities, and the first phase is what's going on in the markets around the world now, and that is really quite simple improvements in traditional businesses. If you take a couple of simple examples, which a lot of local governments are deploying right now, things like upgrading the city lighting to LED lighting, which gives you suddenly a much, much lower cost of electricity, but it also gives you the ability to control and monitor those LED lights much more effectively than the old designs. So that's a team of lighting people improving lighting with a smarter solution. And that doesn't sound very exciting. And it isn't, but it's a first step. And in parallel with that, the people who manage waste are putting sensors on bins to detect when bins are getting full and to help optimize and improve performance of waste management. That's another siloed activity, and we call those sorts of siloed activities phase 1. The really interesting things start to emerge after that, and that is when you get to what we call phase 2, which is when data from something like that LED lighting example and the waste management start to be brought together so that you can innovate with new ideas that use both sets of data from completely different parts of the business. And that continues to evolve until all of the traditional silos within a business, which have all made some steps down this digital path, are actually realizing that sharing right across the board is really fundamental to the future of their business, and they all start doing it. And that's what we call phase 3. And then finally, where a lot of the marketing is today, but none of the reality, is phase 4, when the business is actually being guided very precisely by the use of all the data coming from all the parts of the business. So when we talk about a smart city, we actually are talking about a journey. And I know it's a bit of a metaphor and a bit of an overused term, but the idea that you can get to that phase 4 future without going through the previous phases is just crazy. The point is that councils and governments have got to learn how to use data, and they've got to learn how to use it starting with baby steps. And those baby steps are the ones that are happening right now. And only the first steps towards phase 2 are emerging. So the newer and more interesting ideas that make a city smart are only just starting to emerge in Australia. And in some places they are a little bit more mature, but not much. I mean, we're not dreadfully behind.
Mm. Yeah, no, you speak in my language. I think that it's really important to, particularly in the local governments and councils and also state governments, actually taking a stock take of what's happening internally first, so then it can actually enable some of these other, smarter solutions once we move into that. It's all well and good to have smart lighting, smart parking, and those siloed instances, but when you can kind of merge them together and then use that data, cross-pollinate that data to make decisions, that's when the really exciting stuff happens.
And there are examples, but they're only quite new and early. So when a council CEO asks me what's the killer application for smart cities, or what's the cool thing I really should do straight away, the answer is start. But what they're hoping to hear is, we want you to take the data from this and this and this and this and do this clever thing that this other council has already done and saved lots of money or made lots of money. And really, it's too soon to declare those winners. There's lots of experimenting going on. There's lots of siloed projects delivering great results, but they're all doing old things in new ways. What we've got to get to is the new things in new ways, which we haven't really got to yet.
Cool. So I think you've kind of answered this next question already, but why do you think that this smart city concept is so important?
Well, yeah, I mean, we kind of got there already a little bit, but I think the core of this is cities, and maybe we shouldn't even use the term cities, but communities that people live in need to be as livable as we can make them. And we have a massive challenge in many of the Australian cities, and so does the world, actually. It's not limited to here. But most of the growth and development in our cities over the last 100 years have happened through the age of the car. And we've just about become so dependent on it. And the way we've designed suburbs to be nothing more than dormitories with cars, that people aren't walking to a local cafe or a restaurant or to each other's places because they're just too far away. We're now very, very dependent on cars, and that doesn't make for a livable city. So there's now lots of work going on to try and improve the way a city is laid out and built so that we can walk to various things and we don't have to get in the car every time we want to get a loaf of bread. And, there's a really interesting evolution of thinking going on around what makes a livable city. And communities that actually can walk and talk to each other are considered pretty critical parts of that for both business and pleasure and social behaviour. So, we've seen a bit of a shift in places like Sydney, where now a lot of people want to live right in the heart of the city, and success is considered buying an apartment in the city, not buying a house in the suburbs. And it's partly because of that reason.
Yeah, and I like your term. I like changing the term from city to community. I'm very passionate about that now, because I think as soon as you say city, you polarize the population, and people that aren't living in the city can't engage or don't feel like they can engage. But I think we talk about the term city as kind of being not just, the traditional sense of the term, but, the places that we live, the communities that we live in, the regional areas and the rural areas. But yes, I'm finding that less and less acceptable now. So I'm definitely trying to shift that language to smart community, so then we can have the conversation across the whole board.
Yeah, and really is important. In fact, interestingly, many, many local communities outside of the core city areas are better equipped to do smart things because the footprint of the council is much, much bigger, and it does encompass the entire community. When you look inside a city like Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or other major cities, there's just so many local councils that are contained within the city that it's really hard to get them all to be on the same page at the same time to do something that actually is to the benefit of the entire city. They each are trying to do things, but once again, they're in their own silos, dealing with their own issues within their own little community, and that little community is not big enough to really affect these sorts of significant evolutionary changes that we're describing.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think even the term smart region, so we can start thinking more holistically, because again, even if we have like siloed approaches within streams, but then if we have siloed approaches, that don't cross borders, that's also going to be a problem when we're moving between, cities for work, or pleasure. We want to have a kind of
let me give you a really simple example. A lot of talk now and a lot of work going on to try and improve what's called mobility as a service. In other words, offering consumers an application or an ability to mix and match all the various all of the various mobility choices, cars, buses, trains, push bikes, rental cars, rental bikes, walking, all of those aspects are all open to us in various ways. And based on our interests in wellness and our weather conditions, and these things vary day to day, how do we use all of those tools to deliver our results each day? And when you think about how that sort of mobility as a service model would work, most people don't live and work in the same council footprint. So you can't even develop a service that makes much sense if you're working on it within one council. You need to sort of group councils together and say, hey, we're going to try and develop a service that helps to manage my day, which goes from my home to my gym, to my doctor's surgery, to the office, to out for lunch somewhere, back to the office. Every one of these steps can be a journey provided by a different component of service. And it's not much fun if you've got a rail app and a bus app and a bike app and an Uber app, and the list goes on, and you've got to cycle through them all to decide what's optimum. You can actually imagine, and there are people working on solutions now that allow you to completely work through all of that. You put in some preferences about what suits you, and the weather is taken into account, and your health status and all that stuff. And suddenly you get a choice of, well, it really would be smart if you walked to this bus stop, caught that bus to that meeting, and then caught this train to that one and walked from this bit to that bit. And, that's really mobility as a service. And that will never work if we only do it one local government area at a time.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I actually, that smart mobility concept I'm very passionate about, and I'm heading overseas next year on a Churchill Fellowship to look at just that. So let's hope that I can get some good insights.
Yeah, and that also brings into play all of that challenge around parking and around traffic congestion and all of the other stuff that slows smartness down.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Well, let's talk about, I think we've already kind of talked about this, but how do you think that Australia is kind of embracing this smart community, smart region concept?
Yeah, it's actually very patchy. One of the reasons we formed the IoT Alliance in the first place was because we felt that Australia was culturally tending to want to be an early adopter, but not a leader. It wanted to be what we'd call a fast follower. And in a digital world, in my humble opinion, being a fast follower means coming second. And in digital, that means coming last. If you invent Facebook and then make it global, you can't say, gee, that's a good idea, I'll do that in Australia. It's too late. Somebody did it. You've got to do something different. And you've got to do it first. And the digital economy means that, you get one shot at something. And if you're the first to market and it gets big, then you're it. You can't just go replicate that in another place because the place is not relevant. It's global. So we were really worried that our Australian culture of enjoying watching the world and then deciding what to take as the best examples from around the world was actually a really bad idea in a digital world. So we decided we'd try and get things moving a little and push a bit harder and get people to learn by doing rather than learn by watching everybody else in the world. So we could develop capabilities that could be exported and grow jobs here and do the things that we think are pretty valuable to the Australian landscape. We've got cultural challenge because we have a natural tendency to want to just pick the best from the world, and we've got a long history of doing that very well, but that's not good enough in a digital world. Not if you want to be an exporter of solutions, design things that get sold overseas and be a participant. I mean, it's one thing to just take a good idea and use it. Fine, you can do that. But that's creating jobs somewhere else. You've grow Facebook, all those jobs aren't in Australia, if you know what I mean. We're trying to work out ways of improving our creativity in Australia that we can export and develop. And we do have examples, but there's not enough. There's plenty of action going on, but we're not really competing globally as well as we should.
Yeah, I was just going to say we have a lot of smart people in Australia, particularly, out in the regions that are doing really cool stuff. But how do we, make sure that we've got that connectedness so we can market it to the world?
Well, when you look at something as fundamental as our national broadband network, when that idea was first being talked about, and I was there talking about it when it was happening, we were in the top 10 in the world in broadband connectivity. Right now, Australia ranks 66, and that's pretty sad and very, very hard to recover from, because there are there's 65 other countries that have got better connectivity than we've got, and that's a critical enabler for smart anything.
Yeah, I spent a bit of time in South Korea and have this, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're up there with the fastest internet in the world.
Yeah, they are, and they started very, very early, and they have the luxury of being a very small geography with a very dense population, so they have a real advantage. But having said that, they leveraged very well and very early some very good ideas. I was there, and I used to be in the telecommunications industry supplying that broadband technology into the Asian region, and they were one of the very first to invest heavily, and they did it with a lot of government support early as well. But that's just one example. Almost every Asian country is ahead of us now.
Cool. Okay, let's talk about some of the projects and things that you're currently working on in this space.
Yeah, okay. Well, lots of interesting things going on, and I've been doing a lot of work in developing data sharing policies for local government, which sounds very boring, but it actually is a really critical enabler, because as we've talked about, as councils start gathering data from all of these different siloed businesses, the first challenge is, can they even share it within their own silos, let alone can they share it with their ecosystem of external partners, and can they extract value from that data effectively by sharing it with that ecosystem. And so it's one thing to enable the technology, and we've done a lot of work in that domain as well, but the real challenge has been how to get councils to consistently put in place policy that help them share and open appropriately data without creating risk for them. And so I put a lot of effort and time. A lot of my day job is putting that work in place. But there's lots of other things. Some local governments are really starting to think about the next generation telecommunications equipment. The 5G network that's coming will change the game again for a lot of things that go on in cities. And some councils are starting to explore that and think about how they can be early in that race. I've been doing work there. I've been really quite involved in a number of in sensor network designs and builds around the regional parts of New South Wales particularly. There's some really cool projects that are starting, startup communities based on the fact that there's sensor networks available, and the innovators are coming up with great ways of deploying sensors and gathering data from all sorts of things, anything from boats in a harbour to checking for mooring performance and leakage and all sorts of interesting things, right through to monitoring grapevines for weather conditions that might trigger the botrytis growth, or the list goes on and on of unusual things, and I get myself involved in all manner of these sorts of things.
Cool. Can you tell us a little bit about the IoT Alliance, just for anyone that doesn't know?
Yeah. Well, like I said, we started about 3 years ago, and that was under the Creator Tech brand. Me and a colleague in Creator Tech were positioning what's called the Communications Alliance, which is a body that represents the telecommunications industry. We thought that they might be very interested in this, and we proposed to them that we do a bit of a study of the state of play of IoT in Australia to see just where it might be able to help. And they agreed that was an important area, and they helped fund a report that my colleague and I developed, and that created a lot of recommendations and suggestions. And the board of the Comms Alliance basically said, well, we agree with almost all of that, so let's dive in and see what we can do. And what very quickly happened was the IoT Alliance started to grow well beyond the telecommunications industry, and started to include all of the ICT players in the market who are touching IoT from one perspective or another. and many of the using of IoT type community. The people in agriculture, the people in utilities, the people in councils, the people who work in transport and in manufacturing, and all these different industry sectors. So we found ourselves with almost 500 member companies and organisations now, many of whom are in government agencies, state and federal, and as well as industry groups that represent large groups of other companies. And we've got pretty close now to, I think, 1,000 participating people in the various work groups and work streams and things that we've got set up. So the way we're structured now is we have a bunch of things that we would really describe as enablers, things like platforms and cybersecurity and data handling and things of that nature. And then we have a front-facing part of the organisation, which is really around industry specifics, like smart cities, like utilities, like transport and logistics, that sort of thing. And we've set that up in such a way that we've got a board and we've got an executive council and we've got work groups or work streams, as we call them. I think we've got 12 or 13 work streams now, and I'm sort of now the principal consultant for the whole thing, and I chair the work stream on platforms and interoperability, which is becoming quite an important piece of the puzzle. That's where I'm putting my focus at the moment, and that also links to standardisation work as well. So we're very heavily involved with Standards Australia, and that links us into the international work going on in standards as well.
Excellent. No, thanks for sharing that. I'm really keen to put the links and everything in the show notes so people can click away and find out some more about the IoT Alliance. I've been doing a bit of looking at it myself, and it's definitely something that is really needed, and kind of setting up the, like you said, interoperability and standards, and but also just getting different people involved in the smart city conversation or smart community conversation.
Yeah, and in fact, the really critical thing is the ecosystems you have to develop to make solutions happen. One of the things that really hasn't happened too much before in the internet world is now with the Internet of Things, if you've got a problem that you're trying to solve, there's a very good chance that problem is in an industry outside of the telecommunications industry. It's a water industry problem or a sewerage problem or a finance problem or goodness knows what problem. But many cases, those problems can be addressed by an Internet of Things type of solution. So what we find is a water expert needs to work with an IoT expert to actually come up with the right solution. They each know enough to be dangerous, but they don't know enough to come up with the right solution unless they work together. And that's what I mean by the importance of collaboration. Solutions only come when the collaboration happens between the people who understand the capability of the technology and the people who understand the particular nuances of the problem. And there's tons of examples of really great successes that come from those sorts of collaborations. And we really have to get much better at creating those collaborations and creating that ability to solve problems.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that kind of answers my next question about integrating across the different disciplines. I think it's so much about that collaboration piece and having the right people, but different people at the table when we're making these decisions.
Well, we really do see a great deal of that issue everywhere. Where organisations are structured in what we would describe as an old-fashioned way, where that sort of collaboration is not necessarily even encouraged, let alone achieved. If you're looking at a local council, the different siloed businesses within a local council, they're all competing for budget. So their adjacent council team is almost the enemy while they're going for budget. But what they need to be is best friends. So then where do you fund things from when the real excitement is happening in between two silos? That's all very tricky for local governments to handle. So there's a lot of experimenting and learning by doing that has to happen to break down those old boundaries.
Yeah, I agree. I think governance in the space is so important. But let's move on to this next question because I'm really keen to hear your thoughts. What are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
Yeah, well, certainly the implications of 5G are significant and need to be understood, and that's tricky because that's technically very tricky. The whole issue of cybersecurity is getting talked more about, but not necessarily dealt with effectively. And the IoT Alliance is doing a great deal of work in this area, which we hope will make a real difference in Australia. But the importance of how you secure and protect data and how you share data and how you recognise that sharing data is such an enabler for innovation, I think is something we haven't talked enough about at all in this country. I've been terribly frustrated that we've had a serious run of senior politicians and particularly prime ministers who have tried to position the word innovation in their policies without ever saying anything about how to do it. And in the digital world, the most important enabler for any form of innovation is data sharing. And yet none of them have made that link. So I think that's something we should be talking much more about, recognising that data sharing is fundamental to our future innovation. And just to be a quick diversion, that health record debacle going on right now with government is a classic example. We seriously as a country need to embrace that model, but they've done a really lousy job of selling to us all why it's so important. So, of course, there's plenty of reasons to be sensitive and concerned about it, but we're not hearing the balanced argument. We're only hearing the high-risk side of the argument. And we have to start discussing these things in a grown-up way so that we appreciate that sharing data and fundamentally managing the way we share data is critical to the future of our whole economy, because every industry now is affected by digital information.
Yeah, I agree. I think in order to make the decisions that need to be made, you need, digital diversity across the board, because you can't have people you can't make the best decisions if you don't have the right people at the table. And there's no way that any one person who's only had a background in, say, policy, for example, can make an informed decision about, cybersecurity, at a local level or something like that. And I think embracing that genuine collaboration piece is the only way we're going to be able to make these good decisions moving forward. And then I guess also, that grown-up conversation piece as well about not just having scare stories in the media, but actually what does it all mean, and explaining it in a language that people can understand. That's the only way we're going to be able to do that.
Yeah, I've been very worried that the approach that the federal government's taken with the health records, just for example, is trust us, we're the government. Well, I'm not sure I know anybody who trusts the government anymore. So that trick doesn't work. You have to find a more expansive explanation. And there are some genuinely really, really important reasons why digital health records are a part of our future. And if they're not going to be clever enough to describe them to the community in a way that they can understand it, then why should they embrace it? It's if there's an element of mistrust, then the answer is, well, we won't do it. And if you don't give us a good enough reason to do it, then we won't. Well, I'm afraid they're not giving us a good enough reason right now. Even though we might know many of those reasons, it's up to the government to convince the population that those reasons are incredibly valid and important. And they genuinely are, but they've done a lousy job of trying to sell it.
Yeah, and I think it comes with empowering the community to allow them to make those decisions, if that makes sense, and that they feel like they were involved. If they're just told that they need to change, then that's when people get defensive. But if they're actually involved in the change and can understand the importance of the change, then, you're going to have a much easier time selling something to somebody that's been involved and co-created it. And that, they feel like there's trust and transparency and, people know what's going to happen with that data, and making sure that privacy is paramount. And, that's the number one issue on particularly for if we're talking about my health record. So I think, you're dead set right. And I think the only way we kind of do that is continue to have the grown-up conversations with the community, because they're not, like, the community's smart. They're smart already. We just need to treat them as such and empower them to be able to make these decisions with, alongside the agencies.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tricky issue for me, because I agree the community is pretty well educated around information, but it's also incredibly lazy. Almost all of the problems that we see on denial of service attacks and things are caused by people not even bothering to change default passwords, and that's a really fundamentally flawed thing to do. And nobody should be silly enough to do that, but most of the population truly is, and that's really sad. But on the other hand, health records just to stick with that example, it's an incredibly complex thing to appropriately handle protecting human rights and protecting the safety of that information and sharing it appropriately with the right agencies under the right conditions. And I don't believe there's anybody in the community who has got the patience to sit down and work through all of those issues. But what they do need is some confidence that the people who are working on it will do the right thing. And that's a tough thing to sell when you've got a government who people broadly don't like to trust right now. So it is a bit of a dilemma. It's technically very complex, and there's no way you could explain how it all works to people who are not in the field. But what you can do is explain the consequences of doing it badly and the consequences of doing it well, and ensuring and somehow illustrating just that it is being done well and it's being done well enough to solve the concerns that people really have. And that is hard. I don't deny that getting that messaging right is hard and getting the solution right is hard. But we have to really make a good shot at that, and we're not doing that right now. We're not doing it well enough. We might even have a good solution, but until they tell industry bodies that are trying to help how they're going about doing it and how they are reducing all those risks, then it's very hard for industry to comment about whether it's a good solution or not. So trust us where the government isn't good enough right now.
Yeah, and it is about that transparency, about, we've made, how we've made the good decisions that we've made. Not necessarily the nth degree in the technical detail.
Yeah, but I love thinking about these issues because they are the way we institutionalize change and improvement. And if you reflect on just cars, it's really interesting because today we are living in a society that is quite ridiculously relaxed about the fact that somebody dies in a car crash every day, and dozens of people are permanently disabled through that process. And yet there's enough good value propositions out there for cars that everybody accepts that balance. And that's evolved over 100 years. And if you put that proposition to the community today and said, hey, we've got this great idea, everybody can have a car, but we're going to kill somebody with one every day, the answer would be not a hope of getting that through. That's evolved and we've accepted it. And the value proposition is, yes, there's tons of upside. Yes, there's some downside. And we all are making the judgment that that's an acceptable balance. So we need to be able to explain that balance and get people to realise that, yes, there might be some very, very small risk of some data getting into the wrong hands, but the benefits are enormous. Let's talk about the benefits.
Yep. Okay, cool. Well, it's been so awesome to chat with you today, Geof. I'm really glad I
feel like we're just getting started.
I know. I feel like that as well. We're going to have another conversation, for sure. But I really just have one last question, in this chat, which is, how can people connect with you?
The simplest way is through my Creatortech email address, which is just Geof, 1F Jeff, @creatortech.com, which is just creator with a tech, all one word, simple.
Awesome. And we'll put the links in the show notes so people will be able to connect with you. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Me too. Thanks, Zoe. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Geof.
It's the Smart City Podcast. Whoa!
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart City Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes can be found at thesmartcitypodcast.com. If you have any questions or comments for me or any of my guests, connect with me via email, zoe@thesmartcitypodcast.com, or via the socials. I'm on Twitter and Facebook @SmartCityPod. As always, I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed making it.
Smart City Podcast is what you're looking for.